Welcome to Level Up Your Writing, presented by the Warminster Township Free Library. In our last video about antagonists, I talked about them in relation to character motivation. This video will talk about antagonists from a slightly different approach, and that is their effect on the plot and what purpose they serve in the plot, primarily the conflict they introduce. You can approach this idea in a few different ways, so I'll go over a couple of things for you to consider. When considering what the antagonist's purpose in the plot is, you may first want to figure out what kind of conflict they bring to the story, as you might need to take a different approach depending on the answer to this question. There are a few types of narrative conflict, and most types of conflict can be helpfully broken down into these established categories: man versus man versus nature, man versus self, man versus society, man versus technology, man versus fate, man versus the supernatural, and man versus God. Each type of conflict ties directly into different themes you may be weaving into your story. Your plot may have different types of conflicts that affect the story in different ways, just as you may have multiple antagonists that also affect the story in different ways. One thing you'll want to keep in mind when deciding how your various antagonists will affect the plot is to consider the size or power level of said antagonists. While this can be taken literally, I mostly mean that you should keep in mind the level of difficulty your protagonist will face when confronting and eventually overcoming the antagonist. If the antagonist is overwhelmingly more powerful, you will have a hard time having the protagonist believably overcome it. If they're too easy to overcome, the plot may end up being underwhelming for the reader. This doesn't mean you can only have antagonists that are the same level as the protagonist. Even if the main antagonist is more powerful at the start, you can have lower level antagonists along the way that sort of level up the protagonist, or friends and allies that help the protagonist overcome the antagonist until they are strong enough to do so themselves. For example, in Harry Potter, Harry can't beat Voldemort on his own at 11 years old. Antagonists that are more on his level take the form of characters like Draco Malfoy, and powerful allies that help him include Dumbledore. As Harry grows, the plot requires these overpowered allies to be removed from the story at times, so they don't swoop in and save the day too easily. Having these different levels of antagonist and ally keeps the reader invested and gives reasonable stakes to the plot, as well as giving the protagonist stepping stones they need to eventually tackle larger issues. One way to give your antagonist a stronger presence in the life of your protagonist, and the plot as a whole, is to make things personal. If defeating or overcoming the antagonist is tied to the protagonist's characterization or journey, as well as the themes of your story, it will be that much more closely tied to the plot. If things are personal, your reader will also be more invested in the plot. Personal can take any number of forms, from a direct connection between the protagonist and antagonist, to a more one-sided connection, where something the antagonist did negatively impacted the protagonist, even if the antagonist himself is not aware. One thing to consider is that you can also have it be personal for the antagonist, in addition to or even instead of the protagonist. This is not mandatory and in many cases will not work with the story being told, but it is one way you can look at the connection between the two in a new way. One other thing that can make your antagonist's role in the plot stronger is to think of how they are affecting the plot and characters even when they aren't present. Just like the protagonist's actions have an effect on the plot and the world, so too should the antagonist. But the reader may not necessarily be privy to every moment the way they are with the protagonist. The antagonist does not stop existing when the story isn't focused on them. So, what are they doing when the story isn't focused on them, and how do those actions ripple outward to affect the protagonist's journey? Things that happen off-screen can still affect what happens on-screen. Your characters don't live in a bubble, and the other people in the world you've created aren't frozen in time when the camera looks away from them. We've previously talked about the motivation that drives your antagonists. Don't forget this when you're considering their purpose in the conflict and plot. Think about whether or not they know they're doing the right or wrong thing, and if they think the ends justify the means. And then consider what are their goals and how do those goals interfere with those of the protagonist. Do they stand in direct opposition? Do they overlap? Does one cause another? This week's writing exercise is to think of a story that you're writing or a story that you like, and think of what the antagonist is doing when the protagonist is the focus. Write a scene from the antagonist's point of view, describing what they're doing when the main plot is happening. Think of ways that their actions ripple out to affect the main plot and your protagonist.